Now, having said that, having mentioned in particular freedom of conscience and religion, I'm now displacing the question, the compatibility question, from Islam and democracy, or secularism, to a more precise and controversial issue, which is Islam and the freedom of conscience, which is my last question. Professor of Law Abdullah Ahmad al-Naim in our state, teaching at Emory, I think he's still there, has best articulated that need for the freedom of conscience when he writes in the concluding chapter of his book on secularism. I quote him: as a Muslim, I need a secular state in order to live in accordance with Sharia, out of my own genuine conviction and free choice, personally and in community with other Muslims, which is the only valid and legitimate way of being a Muslim. Belief in Islam or any other religion logically requires the possibility of disbelief, because belief has no value if it is coerced. If I am unable to disbelieve, I will not be able to believe. Maintaining institutional separation between Islam and the state while regulating the permanent connection of Islam and politics is a necessary condition for achieving the positive role of Sharia now and in the future. End of quote. I made that quote because my thinking about this issue of the freedom of conscience is very close to what Abdullah Naim said here. This claim that one needs a secular state committed to pluralism and tolerance because one is a Muslim and not in spite of one being a Muslim, and because as a consequence one's faith only becomes meaningful in such a state, is in fact based upon the very principle expressed in the Quran itself. In other words, what I'm saying is that in spite of his apparently paradoxical and provocative way of stating things, saying it is because I am a Muslim that I need a secular state, actually Abdullah Naim is not doing anything but commenting a Quranic verse which is central to the purpose of tolerance. Let there, says the Quran, let there be no compulsion in religion. Truth stands clear from error. That is the Quranic verse in chapter 2, verse 256. What An-Naim does is to draw the conclusion from that verse that necessarily then compulsion is incompatible with religion. So if one was to say, oh, he says that because primarily he's a professor of law at Emory University in a very progressive liberal institution, and that is how liberals think. Well, yes and no, and it doesn't matter why he is saying that. The whole point is that could he ground it actually on the sacred text of the Muslims, making it have the weight of a Quranic principle upon which Muslims could be able, because of that task ahead of them of inventing the institutions in which they are going to live, to build those institutions upon the principle of the freedom of conscience. So here I could conclude, having said that, the incompatibility, the philosophical incompatibility between belief and disbelief that Abdullah Naim puts forth is very important. You cannot believe if you cannot disbelieve is the best formulation, I think, of the notion of freedom of conscience. It is not just that you are saying, you are not just putting some kind of legal restraint to the capacity to force someone else to convert or not to convert or to stay in religion, etc. You're just saying on the philosophical ground that if you believe in belief, therefore you should have to give room to disbelief. Belief is ultimately fundamentally dependent upon the possibility of disbelief. Here I will conclude this on two remarks. The first remark brings me back to the importance of the internal or mystical dimension of Islam known as Sufism that I have mentioned earlier, commenting on Al-Stefan's ideas. It is the one which insists on the necessarily internal dimension of belief in the way that I have just done. That is why there is a profound connection between this so-called Sufi understanding of Islam and pluralism and toleration. One of the examples, often quoted by Nobel Prize Amartya Sen, when questioning the claim that Europe has some kind of unique privilege of having the monopoly of having declared as a political value toleration, freedom of conscience, and pluralism, is that of Akbar, the Mughal emperor. At a time, Amartya Sen writes, when the inquisitions, I quote, were quite extensive in Europe and heretics were still being burned at the stake, Akbar in Agra, from the 1590s onwards, had pronounced that, I quote now, Akbar from Amartya Sen, no one should be interfered with on account of religion, and anyone is to be allowed to go over to a religion that pleases him. This is from the book that I have mentioned earlier, Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny. Policy of discussion with Muslims and Hindu thinkers, but also Christians, Jews, Parsis, Jains, and even atheists imposed to him may be imposed to him by the fact on the ground that Akbar was a Muslim emperor, but the people he ruled were not, or the majority of them were not. By the way, this has been very well rendered in a beautiful Bollywood movie with all the songs and the beauty of Bollywood movies in Jodha Akbar, a movie that recalls the story of Akbar marrying a Hindu woman, a Rajput princess named Jodha. So that may be the case. Maybe this was just good politics from him because he was an emperor, a Muslim emperor, ruling over a majority of people who were not Muslim. But at the same time, and this is the point which is important once again, at the same time he could root that policy in the Quran in general and the Quranic verse that I quoted in particular. That scriptural basis for a politics of pluralism and toleration is the kind of approach that would define what you would call, if you want to insist on those terms, the progressive Islam that is needed today, that Muslims themselves, I believe, need. Which brings me to my second and final remark concerning the Senegalese case evoked also by Al-Stefan. I would here just say a few words about the way in which it offers an interesting case of a philosophical reflection by the first president of Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor, on the possibility to design a laïcité that would be different from French tradition. And here I'm quoting the French word for secularism because precisely Senegal was a colony of France. And as you know, France has a unique tradition of secularism, which is not the kind of more open Anglo-Saxon model of secularism, if you want to use those categories. Because of its particular history, secularism established itself in France following the defeat of the church. The church had to be defeated, and this is why you have a model of laïcité in France which is very intolerant somehow to the presence of religious manifestation in the public sphere, much more so than other Western countries. having inherited that tradition, Senghor was able somehow philosophically to articulate a conception of secularism that did not mean this kind of defiance and suspicion vis-à-vis religions, but on the contrary, inviting them somehow into the public sphere, but for a work of education, for a work of nation building. Of course, this is a very fragile model. It is always a miracle that the type of model like that continues, but that is the kind of miracle that we probably need to meditate upon these days when we raise the question that I have tried to raise and that I am now submitting to our discussion of Islamic perspectives on toleration, pluralism, and democracy. Thank you so much for listening.
We would love to entertain question and answers, but the time is short. I think we can maybe take 2 quick questions, and then we'll continue the conversation outside. So, are there 2 quick questions? We'll take one from Ian and someone else. Anyone else? Go ahead, Ian.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate your lecture. Just real quickly, I just wanted to know what your opinion was in terms of how Islamic practice after Islamic revolution. I'm reading right now Shrina Badi's personal testimony and what she experienced with the female discrimination. I'm wondering if there is any sort of chronic basis for that, or if there is, how do people put that aside in favor of female equality and all the other rights that a lot of women are fighting for? Thanks.
First of all, applying the same kind of reading I've been doing, there is an affirmation in Islam about a radical ontological equality between men and women. And what I call radical ontological equality in being is, for example, the account of the origin of the two. Instead of having one of them come out of the rib of the other one, we'll see which one it is, they say that they came from one single breath out of one single soul. Okay? This affirmation of the radical ontological equality, for the kind of reading and the kind of interpretation of Islam that I identify myself with, means that you have a gap between what I would call the religious ideal and the sociologies. So you need to fill the gap separating the ideal and the sociologies. You cannot have the affirmation of a radical ontological equality on the one hand and have the kind of sociologies, patriarchal sociologies that most of Muslim societies are actually witnessing. And this is the kind of scriptural basis for the struggle for equality that many are also conducting in Muslim society.
Thank you again. Let's thank our guest speaker for